I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit more speculative in nature towards the end of the talk, but I'm going to tell you a little bit more about some of the more recent developments on what I think is a very interesting paradigm within the context of density functional theory to try and get us to higher levels of predictability in our modeling. So the reason we use DFT is typically because we want to predict some behavior of some quantum system. And we now, I think, are starting to position ourselves at a place where we are able to use machine learning techniques and various other computational techniques to really drive forward the accuracy aspects of DFT, not so much speed. So based on the level of people who are in this talk, some of you will be experts in this. And so to those of you who are experts, I'll apologize for the initial slides, which are very basic. But I've tried to gear this a little bit across the spectrum. So I'm going to give you a very, very gentle, if you like, introduction into what specifically the universal density functional is and why we care about it and why I think you should care about it too. And then I'll just outline a little bit some of the early developments that we've been doing now over the past few years on trying to improve the quality of the exchange correlation functionals in a systematic way. And this matters because work on the exchange correlation functionals has been going on for many, many years and decades even. But the systematic nature of that improvement is something that's quite difficult to achieve. And then I'll maybe end with a little bit of speculation on how this can potentially help us and pave a way towards trying to see whether or not we can investigate the nature of the universal density functional itself. Okay, so very briefly, most of you will know this, of course, right? What's the point of running various types of quantum electronic structure calculations? And the reason is that the ordinary matter that we typically really care about, it's made of atoms, right? And people have been looking at these things for quite some time. And we know they follow the laws of quantum mechanics. And so from these laws, we can find all kinds of very, very fascinating and interesting behavior, which ranges from things like superconductivity that you see here, functioning of various types of solar cells, including the perovskites and potentially cheap mass-produced solar cells, all across to things that are used in chips, right? So that's from transistors all the way up. And then across the range of all of chemistry, all the way to biology, proteins, large systems, molecules, and so on. So there's this full range of very, very complex, fascinating behavior that we're familiar with in everyday life. But it's all based around the interactions of atoms and electrons in some sort of condensed matter systems. And so this was recognized quite a long time ago by Paul Dirac, who, and this is 1929, so this is almost 100 years ago, right? He said, well, look, the underlying physical laws necessary for the mathematical theory of a large part of physics, and this is mainly, he's talking about condensed matter physics here, and the whole of chemistry, right, is completely known. And the difficulty is only in the exact application of these laws and how that leads to equations that are simply too complicated to be soluble, right? So in his own words, what he's effectively saying is we know the laws, the problem is not knowing the laws, right? The laws of quantum mechanics, the Schrödinger equation or the Dirac equation. The problem really is that for any real life application, they're so complicated, we don't know what to do, right? And so some sort of workaround needs to happen to try and help us bridge the gap between this huge complexity, right? And the fundamental complexity comes from, of course, the time-dependent and, well, specifically, I'll focus here on the time-independent Schrödinger equation, right? But if you're looking for time-type phenomena, it's the general time-dependent Schrödinger equation. And this has been written down and known now for a long time, right? So there's, you might think, nothing particularly new here to look at. But of course, the problem is that it's quite difficult to calculate, right? So there are two fundamental ways that people have been thinking about dealing with this over the past maybe 10, 20 years or so. And the first is the physics-based approach, right? Where you have some description of some system of some sort. This could be a molecule, it could be a structure, it could be something more complicated. You feed that into some sort of quantum chemistry simulator. And this could be, a DFT-based code. It could be something else. It could be quantum Monte Carlo. It could be any Hartree-Fock, any one of your preference type things, depending on what you want. You use physical laws or some approximation to those physical laws to give you a property of interest, which could be something complicated or something easy. It could be a band structure. It could be a total density. It could be an atomization energy. It could be some other a conductivity, for example, some other property. And hopefully, if your simulator is accurate enough, this will work, right? The good thing in this is that depending on the simulator, it can be quite accurate. It's generalizable. We'll come back to this later on in the talk, but it's generalizable in the sense that this approach, in principle, shouldn't depend on your choice of molecule. So if it works for one molecule, you'd hope it would work for all of them. Now, that doesn't quite work for all of them, of course, right? But within quite a large family, you do have a reasonable expectation that systems that look similar will behave similarly. But the big downside, of course, is it's slow. It's computationally incredibly expensive. So if you really want it to be accurate, and you take the most accurate tools that we have today, it is painfully slow, and which means that you're now restricted to very basic systems, very small systems, simple things, and so on. An alternative approach to do this is really to look at sort of the pure data science type machine learning approach. And this has become quite popular over the past decade or so, where again, you have the properties of interest in the output and the description of the molecules or the systems that you're interested in the input. And you have those two data sets and you look for correlations between the two, right? So you try and build a black box model in between that allows you to move from one to the other so that when you change some sort of description, you can predict in some way how the property of interest changes. And now that's appealing for many reasons, right? It's a typical learning problem. The problem with it, of course, is that the fundamental issue is that we now have to learn all of the physical laws. So the things that already Dirac told us that we know, we're now pretending to not know them anymore, right? So it's maybe necessary to do this from various ways, but it's not very smart in the sense that, well, you know the physical laws. There doesn't seem to be much sense in trying to forget them and build a new infrastructure without taking those laws into account, right? But it turns out that's what you do. And the big problem then is, well, what's the correct inductive bias, right? So the inductive bias in a typical learning system is that set of rules, if you like, that try to constrain the relationship between the inputs and the outputs of a learning process. And we don't know, right? So for general quantum system, it's not quite clear what the correct inductive bias should be, other than the basic physical laws that we're, of course, familiar with, right? So the problems here, of course, are different from the typical physical approach, right? The big benefit is that these are very fast. So once they're trained, it might take forever to train them, but once they're trained, they're really, really quick. So you can query them very easily, which is nice for many reasons. But their accuracy is highly limited. So machine learning is typically something that you sacrifice some accuracy and you try and gain a lot of speed. And if you're able to sacrifice that accuracy, then this works. And if not, then it doesn't, right? And there's a big problem with out-of-sample limitation. So that means when you treat things that are slightly different, you might get complete nonsense, right? So the generalizability kind of falls down. But still, there are many, many use cases for this. And this is particularly popular in various aspects of quantum chemistry. If you can restrict your phase space quite a lot, you can look at very complicated type of energy surfaces and energy landscapes, and you can investigate the behavior of certain systems in a very convenient way. So it certainly has its place, but it's a very different paradigm in terms of thinking about things. Okay, so if we just focus a little bit more on the quantum simulator, what we're going to try and do here in this talk is we're not really going to go for the second. We're going to try and look at the first, and we're going to try and improve the first aspect of this with some machine learning tools, but we're going to continue to follow a physics-based approach, because that really is the aspect that I at least personally think is the most interesting in the long-term development, because it retains the understanding that we currently have. We don't have to throw it away and then try and guess it via correlations. We can keep that information. And what we're going to do is we're going to use that core physical information that we have as an inductive bias in a machine learning problem. Okay, so very quickly, when I talk about quantum antibody problems, right, what is the problem? So if you just take a simple system here, the greens are the ions, right? The reds are the electrons, and then you have arrows of 3 different colors, which indicate the Coulomb interaction between 2 ions or 2 electrons or an ion and an electron, right? So they're positively or negatively charged. So the Hamiltonian, if you write it down, right, will have, well, can be separated, if you like, into these 3 terms. You have the green term, which is just the ion term, and this is typically not problematic because for most systems, this bit is very close to being classical, right? Not for all, but for most. The blue term here is the electron-ion interaction. And again, that's something that we know how to do reasonably well. That's not overly complicated because the interaction between the electron and the ion is quite easy to deal with. But the red term tends to be really hard, right? So that's the Hamiltonian term that corresponds to electron-electron interactions, right? They occur on very fast timescales. They're very difficult to model. And we have a lot of electrons, right? Now, in principle, we can figure out what the ground state energy of this system is, which is one of the core things that we're interested in. And we can use various approaches. We could use the variational principle and so on. But fundamentally, from the theory point of view, you really need to know what the many-body wave function is. So that's that psi that you see over there that you then use to find the expectation value of the operator H. And the problem is that it has a lot of dimensions, right? So the many-body wave function is a many-body wave function, and unfortunately, it depends on the position of all the possible particles that you have in your system. And so if you have n of them and your system is quite large, you start to see this becomes a hugely complicated multidimensional problem. And all of a sudden, you just drown in computation. And so you can't really go very far in this, even with modern quantum Monte Carlo techniques. You're limited to very, very small numbers. All right. So many people have been looking at this over the past 100 years. So very, very briefly, you can kind of take computational cost, which is on the x-axis, right? So that counts effectively how well or how poorly the model that you take will scale with increasing electrons, right? So all of these systems, everything will work for one electron, right? So a hydrogen atom, we know how to do it, right? You put in 2 or 3, you can get away with pretty much anything. When you have 1,000 electrons, all of a sudden, the scaling matters hugely, right? So we have the computational cost and the scaling on the x-axis. And then the other thing that you care about is accuracy of prediction, which is to say, well, how good am I in making a prediction on a specific quantity, right? So if I try and calculate something because I need it, how well would it agree with me doing the same thing in a lab or doing an experiment or actually trying to, design a new material, for example, right? How likely is it to do the things that I need it to do, to have those properties? So we really want as high an accuracy as possible for most systems, but it turns out that's quite difficult to do, right? So you can kind of break down this thing into 4 quadrants that I'll talk about a little bit, right? So the first is models that are not very accurate, but are cheap. And there's a place for them to some degree, but it's good for a first step, but it's not maybe good for the more advanced work that you want to do. The absolute worst case, and most things that you can just write down on a piece of paper would kind of fall in this, which is stuff that's not very accurate, but is still ridiculously computationally expensive. So this is kind of hell, right? You spend all your time doing something and it's still wrong. So you certainly don't want that. Anything that falls into that quadrant, you throw away immediately because it's pointless. The opposite to that is heaven, right? So that's something that is immensely accurate and very cheap. And well, that doesn't exist, but it's our ambition. So what we would like to do is we'd like to come up with algorithms or approaches to electronic structure that bring you to heaven. So they give you chemical accuracy, right? So very, very high accuracy at a low cost, potentially. And then there's kind of the last quadrant, which is sort of where we are in reality, which is if you want very high accuracy, you're going to have very high computational cost. Your scaling is going to be very poor, right? And so that's the top bit, and that's kind of reality. And where we really live is we live on a diagonal line across this, right? So we're not quite in hell because we throw that stuff away immediately. We're not in heaven because nobody's quite solved the problem. But we live kind of on this diagonal, and you can see you start with methods that start from things like Hartree-Fock, which, on this scale seems cheap, but it's still actually quite expensive, not very accurate. And then you go all the way up to things like configuration interaction mechanisms, coupled clustered calculations that are very popular across quantum chemistry. And then all the way to the most accurate things that we have, right? So the configuration interaction type simulations with singlets, doublets, triplets, and quadruplets, right? So things that scale n to the 10, something ridiculous, right? So you can get extreme accuracy at very, very high cost. And if you're confined to this diagonal, you're not very happy, right? Because it means that there's kind of a no free lunch type theorem, which just says, well, if you want to do better, you just have to spend a lot more time. And that's a log scale, right? So that's kind of difficult. Okay. Now, the hope is that machine learning can sort of help us a little bit, but typically what machine learning does is it trades accuracy for time. So what it will do is it'll kind of bring you back down. And it's not really clear if you'll be able to deviate from the diagonal. The hope is perhaps yes, right? But it's not clear. It depends on the type of problem. It'll certainly make the computational cost go down if you can implement some of this, but you will sacrifice some accuracy for that. So then there'll be cases where this kind of works, but in most generic cases, that's not going to be quite the solution. There are, of course, other techniques, right? And I'll come to that in a minute. Density functional theory, I think, is one of these almost magical type approaches, which promises maybe to get us close to heaven in some subset of electronic structure calculations, right? But it kind of tries to address this question of chemical accuracy. Can we do really low computationally expensive simulations and still get chemical accuracy? And so DFT is fundamentally interesting because it deviates from this diagonal, right? So it goes straight up in a certain sense. You can do even better scaling than n to n cubed, of course, today. But in terms of accuracy, it's sort of medium level accuracy, right? So it's not chemically accurate, at least not for generic system that you have, but it's much better than other models that you have. And so, of course, this is one of the reasons why it's by far the most popular electronic structure calculation, because it's something that takes you off this diagonal quite successfully. So it got these two chaps a Nobel Prize in physics. Of course, you all know this, which is great, right? That's wonderful. But the thing that I want to talk a little bit more about is this interesting observation that was made, which is quite basic, and even the proof is quite simple, which is marvelous, right? Where Holmberg and Cohn already back in 1964, they said, and they proved that there exists a universal function of the density, this F here of NR. Note these square brackets means they're functionals, not functions. And it's independent of the system of the ions where you put them and so on, right? But it primarily concerns the electron system, the electron subsystem, so the little red arrows that I showed you before, and it's universal, which means that it's system independent. So all electron systems that are in some sort of condensed matter type arrangement, they will adhere to the same universal overall density functional, and it exists, it has to exist. And if you knew it, if you had a way to calculate it, then you could find the exact ground state energy of an interacting electron system, right? Which is the holy grail of condensed matter physics in this sense. So this thing exists, which is great. Now the problem is, of course, there are two problems. The first is, even if it exists, we don't know it, right? And the second problem is there is no prescription in this theorem or in any other to help you approximate it, right? Increasingly better. So not only do you not know what it is, there's no pathway either towards it either. So it's one of these wonderful things that turn out to not be so useful because you don't know what to do with it, right? Or do you? So this is I think what we're going to try and do is come up with a scheme to see whether or not we can maybe learn something about the format of the universal functional. Okay, so density functional theory, just very briefly, the thing that we're actually going to care about is we will make use of density functional theory, right? So for those of you, most of you will know this, for those of you who don't, right, it is by far the most popular electronic structure code in existence. It occupies a substantial percentage of supercomputer usage worldwide. It's quite remarkable of how so this is not a single code base, if you like, but it's a single technique, if you take the whole set of it, is extremely popular, right? And what it really does is it allows you to move away from the quantum many-body problem where you're really worried about many-body wave functions, which have these ridiculous number of dimensions, and into a new system where you really only care about the density, right? The electron density only has 3 dimensions, so that's great. You have a dimensionality reduction there. But the practical way in which this is done in most cases is via this thing called the Kohn-Sham equations, which transforms the interacting electron system into a non-interacting system of the so-called Kohn-Sham particles. So they're not electrons, not quite. They're completely non-interacting things. And then they move around in this funky potential, the Kohn-Sham potential that is constructed sort of ad hoc in such a way so that the Kohn-Sham density that you create is, in the ideal case, exactly the same as the interacting electron density from your many-body problem, right? And so it's shown that this can be done. You do a little bit of algebra and you find that actually this can be done exactly this transformation, provided you know the format of this thing called the exchange correlation functional down here. Right? So what I'm showing you here is this funny potential has all the terms that you know. So these are the standard interaction terms that I already showed you before, and that's fine. And then there's all the stuff that you don't know that you can stick into this little thing called the exchange correlation functional, which is related to the universal density functional that I talked to you about, right? So this is the thing that includes in it all those pesky little quantum many-body interactions that we don't quite understand. And it is the only thing that you don't understand in this model. So these you know how to do perfectly. Right. So your way to find the exchange correlation functional now becomes very, very important. So if you assume for a minute that you know what this is exactly, then you can solve the Kohn-Sham equations and Kohn-Sham density functional theory exactly, and you can get the exact densities. And that, of course, is a very, very interesting thing. Again, the problem is much like in the case of the universal functional, that we don't know what the exact exchange correlation functional is. And in fact, we don't even know how to systematically really improve them. There's been a huge amount of effort spent on this. There's many, many hundred exchange correlation functionals that you can try. People now have a good empirical understanding of which ones to use for which systems. But if you have a completely new system, the general idea is that what you do is you just try all the functionals, you see which one works best, and then you use that. So there's a very empirical sort of post hoc type approach to this, which kind of tells you that we haven't quite understood or managed to capture the full physics, the full complex many-body physics within the models that we currently have for the exchange correlation function, right? But still, this map is absolutely beautiful because it's an exact map between a problem that's fundamentally insolvable, right, as Dirac already noted, and something that is actually quite solvable, provided you knew what this quantity was, right? So it is unknown and in fact very hard to find, and perhaps even unfindable, right? So that's the problem. So the interesting thing that I'm going to try and explore a little bit more in the next part of this talk is whether or not we can take density functional theory, right? So the complexity of it is roughly down here, which makes it wonderful. But the accuracy of it in real life typically depends. So it depends on a lot of numerical schemes and techniques and all of that, for sure. So that's, you know, the actual implementation matters a lot. I'm assuming you have perfect implementation, right? So from the purely theoretical point of view, the accuracy really only depends on the exchange correlation functional and the quality of that functional in relation to the samples or the systems that you're interested in exploring, right? So you get to pick them. And you'll find that if you take a very different functional, your accuracy can go all the way from being quite low to reasonably high, right? And so the question then is, well, can we use some of these new techniques that we have for machine learning and automatic differentiation and so on to try and bump that up? So we're not using machine learning in the standard sense of trying to sacrifice accuracy to increase speed. What we're doing is the opposite. We're actually going to sacrifice speed in this point a little bit. Not the complexity, just the speed. And we're going to try and do that in order to gain in accuracy. So we're going to try and do something that's a little bit weird for a machine learning type person, right? But hopefully I'll be able to convince you that there is some hope that this just might work, right? And again, ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to get to heaven, right, on these quadrants. So we're trying to take something that's computationally not too expensive and getting us to chemical accuracy. Now, chemical accuracy has this beautiful number that people always try and achieve, and that's 1 kilocalorie per mole. So if you get an accuracy where your uncertainties are less than a kilocalorie per mole, then you get the approval of the chemists, I guess. Physicists, we tend to stop caring a little bit earlier than that because we're maybe slightly sloppier, but that's kind of the level that you need to be able to do to compete with things that people can measure in the lab. Okay, so a practical example, if you like. I just have one very quick slide here just to show you why this matters in real world cases. So one of the things that personally I'm very interested in, my research group works on, is we look at exoplanets, and we're interested in the equation of state of exoplanets. So these are planetary systems that are not inside our solar system. They're in other solar systems, possibly very far away, and we can detect them via various methods using big telescopes and so on. And so we can see they exist. We can measure some very basic properties like how big they are, how heavy they are. We can do a little bit of spectroscopy maybe to see if they have an atmosphere, what gases are in there and so on, but you can't do too much. And from all of those results, you have to come up typically with some sort of model of the planet, and you try and figure out things that you really care about, which is not just if it exists out there, but is it potentially habitable? What is it made of? Does it have a proper atmosphere? Could that atmosphere sustain life? Does it have a magnetic field? Does it have a molten core? Things like that. All of those things can only really be done if you have the ability to model these systems accurately, right? And if you don't, you don't. So you need to know this thing called the equation of state. So you need to know how the pressure and the temperature relates to the density of these systems. And all of this is computational. And a lot of it is going to be based on density functional theory calculations. And so what you can quickly see here, I have the equation of state of hydrogen done with a different set of different types of calculations and different types of exchange correlation functionals that you put in. You can get very different results in the behavior of what hydrogen is meant to do at a certain, so this is quite high pressure, right? 200 GPa and quite high, well, relatively high temperatures, right? You get quite a range of things. But you also get a range of very different properties of the systems, even in reasonably simple conditions. So this is aluminium, the conductivity of aluminium. You have the experimental points here, and then you have three different. So these are the same type of DFT calculations. They've only picked three different exchange correlation functionals, right? So you have the very famous PB, which is a generalized gradient approximation type system. You have SCAN, and then you have a slight advancement on that. And you can see the differences are non-negligible in the prediction, and they tend to disagree to some level with experiments as well. And if you really want to see the limitations of an exchange correlation functional, all you have to do is go to transition metals, right? So things with d-band electrons and so on. And you'll find that even there, depending, this is a whole list of exchange correlation functionals. I'm not going to go through that now, but you get a huge difference in the predictive capability of your simulation. It's all DFT. It's all uses the same algorithms. It's all the same approach, the same theory. But the accuracy of the exchange correlation functional is the one that makes a huge difference in terms of how right or how wrong you are when you try and make a prediction, right? So people have tried to address these things for some time using machine learning. And I think the first was done by, again, this is the research group of Kieran Burke in California. So Burke is the B from the PBE, which is by far the most used exchange correlation functional, and is the one that, if you don't know anything else, is probably the one you should start off using because it's excellent. It's not the most accurate, but it's one of the most general, and it's cheap to implement. It's cheap to use. So about 10 years ago, they started playing a little bit around with these exchange correlation functionals learned by machine learning with some toy models, and they can show that they can learn some behaviors in a simple 1D model, and that was very interesting. A big step forward was really achieved by the Japanese group of Akashi and Sugino. This is now a few years ago, when they actually framed this in a very interesting way, where the exchange correlation functional was represented by a neural network, and then they tried to train this. It was immensely difficult to train. It was very, very difficult to do, but they could show that they could get some very interesting results and that there was some potential for this. And I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to read some of these articles, because they go into a lot more detail and I'll be able to tell you about. But these are the first two examples, and there's a couple of a few more where people have started thinking about how machine learning can be used to increase the accuracy of the tools, of the modeling, of the approach, of the paradigm, if you like, of calculating electronic structure, not just used to increase speed. So most importantly, not used to try and substitute the physics, right? So these are not approaches that are throwing out the physics and then trying to use machine learning to put them, but they're trying to get physics to work together with machine learning to give us more accurate predictions. And that's really interesting. Okay, so the building blocks of the theory is typically, well, how does it work? Well, you come in with some description, and in DFT, you also have to come in with an exchange correlation functional. Those are inputs that come from the beginning. You pick them. Then you have this yellow bits of stuff, which is just the cycle, right? This is Consham DFT specifically. It's a convergent cycle, so the calculation has to converge. You have to get some self-consistent densities corresponding to the potentials that you calculate. And then once you're satisfied that the convergence is good enough, life is good, right? So you're effectively calculating this potential over here, and then you're putting in your little Consham particles. You're taking those, use those to calculate the density, make sure everything's fine. So the standard approach to machine learning would be, okay, well, let's just throw all of this out. We'll put in a description of a molecule, and we'll put in a big black box, and this will do all kinds of magical type of inference things that machine learning data scientists like to do, try and find all the fancy correlations between the description on one side and the output quantities on the other, right? And so you can do this, and there's quite a lot of literature on this. The big problem, of course, is that this black box now doesn't only have to learn the properties of your specific molecule, but it has to learn all of quantum mechanics as well. And that turns out to be really difficult to do reliably. And so you run into all the standard problems of machine learning. But of course, if you can restrict your system, then it works quite well. So it's faster, but it's less accurate. And what we really want to do is something a little bit different. So the idea here is to try and use this technique called gradient backpropagation directly within the Consham equations of density functional theory, right? So gradient backpropagation is, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, again, without too much detail, it's
a technique that's widely used to optimize and train neural networks in deep learning. And what it relies on is automatic differentiation. So this idea that you can write a code that has to do certain mathematical operations, and those mathematical operations can be broken down using the chain rule. And in machine time, it'll calculate the derivatives of all of the parameters with respect to all of the other parameters as well and propagate them forward. And what this allows you to do in a complicated chain of workflow of mathematical operations, which a DFT code is, it allows you to have the gradients at each step. And because you have the gradients at each step, your flow of information doesn't only flow from, as we've seen here, from top down, so from the inputs and then through these various solvers, but you can use the gradients to go backwards as well. So this is called back propagation, where you effectively, for example, here you would start with some density or some energy or some force, a change in the force, and you would ask yourself, well, if I change my force by so much and so much, what do I need to change my electron density to mimic that, or some other object, right? So you're able to propagate in reverse the same pathways. So that's very, very important, right? So from a computational technique, this is a little bit expensive and you need tools to do it, and it's non-trivial on how you implement this. But from just the basic conceptual idea, it's pretty straightforward. What it allows you to do is go forwards and backwards, right, in your simulator. So what we're going to do is then we're going to take out the exchange correlation functional that you can see up here, and we're going to substitute the model for that functional with a neural network. So that neural network is simply going to be acting as a universal approximator. So an object that's able to approximate any function you like, right? So it's not trying to learn any funny correlation or anything. It's simply a way to parameterize a function without using basis functions explicitly, right? You directly use the neural network architecture as the basis. You're going to use that. And the question is going to be phrased in the sense of, well, if I know my molecular descriptions and if I know what the properties ought to be, can I use that to infer what the exchange correlation functional should look like, right? So you can phrase the problem in this way, and it then becomes a functional optimization problem, which is hard. So it's a hard functional optimization problem because the space of functionals is in itself very hard. You need to backpropagate. So that's a little bit annoying because it means you have to rewrite all the code from scratch because existing code doesn't have gradient propagation in it, right? And so we did that. Code, it's called differentiable quantum chemistry, DQC. And then, of course, as I said, the idea is to think of this simply as an optimization. So I give you the data that I know, and this could be simulations, it could be experiment, it could be fancy stuff. I give you everything I know, and then I try and figure out what's the best possible functional that reproduces all of the known results from nature that we have today. And then the hope is the thing converges, it generalizes, it works, right? That we don't know. We can hope. So if you're interested in the actual software elements of this, it's all available on GitHub. You can download it, it's free. We spent a lot of time building this. And the main work here really is the work of Mohammed Kasim, was working in my group and myself back, it was published in PRL a couple of years ago. And of course, of Li, again, from Kieran Burke's group, who earlier that year showcased effectively the same paradigm in one dimensions. So those are the two key papers for this. Okay, so this is the idea. As I said, we're going to start off with the functional represented as a neural network that will encode all of these many-body interactions in some way, feed into DQC, collect the data set of things, and we're going to try and minimize the loss. So we're going to try and make sure that all the predictions that DQC gives us with a specific functional match as closely as possible things that we know have to be true, right? And for the functionals, we're just going to focus on two types, on the local density approximation functional and a generalized gradient approximation functional. So two of the first two rungs of Jacob's ladder of functional approximation. And we're going to use a hybrid approach here. We don't have to. So we've already done this also without, but just for the sake of argument, a hybrid approach. So we start off with a well-conditioned LDA, and then it moves to a neural network. This F is the neural network, right? And then we can use that to predict. So we can change the exchange correlation functional at each iteration. We tweak it a little bit. We see how well the results look. If they don't look too good, we look at how wrong they are, and then we back propagate, figure out how we need to change the exchange correlation functional. We change it and we try again. And that's the loop. We do the training. Okay. So what does the training look like? So we're going to train on 9 molecules, and you'll immediately note that this is not big data, right? We don't have 100,000 samples. We're not training a large language model with billions of parameters, right? 9 molecules, very simple molecules. Atomization energy of 4 of them, and then a few density profiles, and that's it. So that's the training. The validation is the thing that we check just to make sure we don't overfit. So it's not directly training, but it's something that we look for. And we're going to validate on just 7 molecules, very small data set. With that, we're going to build our exchange correlation functionals. So the ones that are the best on the subset of red, and we're going to test it on the black stuff, right? So note the black stuff has a whole bunch of things that aren't present in the red stuff. So there are atoms there that aren't present in the red group. There are bonds that aren't present in the red group. The sizes are substantially larger, right? So we're really testing on things that are completely different. And the reason we do that is because we're really interested to know whether or not we've actually learned something, or if we've just built a model that's slightly better for H2, right? A model that's slightly better for H2 nobody cares, and nobody should care. It's not very interesting. If we can train on H2 an exchange correlation functional that helps us with, say, this large hydrocarbon, now that's interesting, right? Because that means you've learned something about the fundamental physics of the way these molecules bond together. And so here are the results. The quantity we're looking at is the atomization energy. So that's the energy that's required to separate a molecule into its constituent particles, okay? So if we just start with the LDA across our big data set, the mean absolute error is this plot over here. After our training on this small subset here of just 9 molecules, we see that we have a huge improvement in the quality. So this is our exchange correlation trained via this paradigm, to the point where it's better than the GGA approximation was just raw. If we start with the GGA, we about halve the error on that. We double the accuracy to the point where it's almost as good as SCAN, not quite, but it's better than CCSD, right? So that's a couple clustered method. So these in green here are methods that are just benchmarks because they use much more accurate approaches to what we're trying to do. So we can really, really improve the accuracy on the atomization. If out of the full group, we just pick a few things and we simply pick, say, only the hydrocarbons. So we're not going to look at all of the molecules, but just the hydrocarbons. Note that there is no hydrocarbon in our training at all. So we've not seen the hydrocarbons. The model that we're trying to train doesn't know they exist. So we're testing it on something that's completely different and new. You see, you end up with a very accurate LDA model, and you end up with a PBE model that we've trained. So the light blue and the light orange here are the trained models with our exchange correlation functional. That is, again, twice as good as CCSD, right? Which is really, really quite extraordinary. We can then do the same thing with molecules, with different atoms, where the atoms are much larger than atoms present in our training data set. And the reason that's important is because the bonding between these heavier atoms will occur from electronic orbitals that are much higher quantum number orbitals. And so they would not have been present in the training in any shape or form. So we couldn't have just learned from the training data set some gimmick, right? We are actually trying to learn something fundamental about the way the exchange correlation incorporates correlation effects, electron correlation effects, and possibly electron exchange effects in the many-body physics problem. Again, you see LDA, we can improve a lot. This time, we can't really improve the PB too much, but we can improve it a little bit, right? It's not worse, though. So we do a bit better. And we're now competitive with CCSD, as was PBE, right? So the improvement here is really not very large. But in the LDA case, we can make a very, very big difference. Again, that's great. Okay, so how about we now look at a quantity that we've not trained for, right? And this is interesting because it tells us something about what it is that we're actually doing in this model. So here what we're looking at is we're asking ourselves how accurate we are in predicting the ionization potential of atoms that go from hydrogen to argon. So we've not ever told our training to try and optimize the quality of the ionization. We've only told it to try and optimize the atomization, right? So the splitting of molecules apart. It doesn't know this ever exists. So it made changes to the exchange correlation functional to optimize the atomization energy without knowing anything about what ionization is. And in fact, what you then quickly see is that the results are substantially worse. So if we just take the LDA, the quality of the LDA model is over 5 times worse, right? So we've made it substantially worse. We've tweaked the exchange correlation functional to optimize one property, and we've sacrificed the property that we've not seen at all, so that these new properties are now In the LDA case, 5 to 6 times worse, and in the PB case, maybe 3 times worse, right? So this is bad if you want to use it, but this is very good from the point of view and interpretability of what we're doing, because this is exactly what you'd expect. Well, you've not optimized for this, and so it will get worse. So we said, okay, well, let's fix it, but let's fix it in the smallest possible way. We'll simply add 2 numbers to the training. So we'll make sure that our model now knows that ionization is a thing. So we'll add the ionization of neon and oxygen. That's all, 2 numbers. And we're going to try and make sure that whatever changes we include in the exchange correlation functional also have to take into account the fact that we don't really want the ionization energies to get much worse. And then what happens is the step that you see from the second bar here to the third, you improve hugely the quality of the predicted uncertainty on the ionization energy. They're still worse, and that's probably because we've not trained with a large enough data set, but you've pretty much got rid of the horrible decrease in quality. Because now all of a sudden the model knows that it's constrained. It cannot just optimize one thing, it has to work on the other as well. While we do this, we find that there is now a small price to pay when it comes to back at the atomization energy, but that price is very, very small. So the atomization energy does get a little bit worse, but not too much. So it doesn't actually make too much of a difference there, right? So for those of you who are familiar with sort of Pareto front type analysis, this looks very much like a Pareto front type multi-objective optimization, right? We have multiple objectives. We have a model, in our case, an LDA or GGA model that is unable to satisfy all of them completely. And so when you try and improve one, you're going to penalize the other, right? And so we can show, at least we've showed that in terms of these terms, the exchange correlation functionals that we train sit on the Pareto front of the objectives that we set out, as does, by the way, PB. So PB is over here, and the XCNN are our exchange correlation neural network models. You have one here, that's PBE. And then these are some other exchange correlation models, and you can see our models here, depending on what you do. So when you have multiple objectives, you now have a systematic way to move across these objectives via this type of training by defining what it is that you want to do. Another way to ask yourself of what we're doing is to look at what we're learning. And I'm showing this, just on the LDA side. So this is some very recent work done by Kareem, a student in my group. We're only looking at this in the LDA side because it's easy to plot. If you go to higher order exchange correlation functionals, you have too many parameters and it gets a little bit difficult to do. But what I'm showing here is the density. So you can see the density, it goes from very low density to high density. And these aren't LDA models, so they're not really functionals, they're functions. So you just give them a density and a point. And that's what we're doing here. And then you can calculate what the energy output is that you want. And epochs is the training. So within this process of training the LDA model, and you can see very, very quickly, you move to a regime that kind of looks all the same. And the changes that we're looking for here is the changes of our trained model compared with the standard LDA model, which just used the PW form of the correlation with the standard LDA exchange. And you can see it matches it really, really well. So there's almost no difference. There's a little bit of an oscillation, except at the low density regime. So in the low density regime, our model pushes up this tail, which you can see here as well. So what it's really trying to do, it's trying to increase the impact of the exchange correlation at really, really low densities. And that's what's giving us an improvement in the LDA capability or ability to model the atomization energy specifically, right? So it's interpretable in the sense we can understand what we're doing, right? We can interrogate the model and we can look at it. Okay, good. So I'll close here and I'll just summarize a little bit. So the idea here is that the integration of physical laws and machine learning techniques is useful. And what we can show is that it can systematically allow us to construct new exchange correlation functionals, and that these functionals generalize really well. So they're not just functionals that are built for a specific molecule or for a specific group of molecules, but they're functionals that are built for specific properties across the range of molecules. And you get to pick what those are. And the limitations are fundamentally given by the type of properties that you want to train to and the representation that you have of the exchange correlation function. So it becomes an algorithmic problem to trying to find optimal exchange correlation functionals, as opposed to almost an artsy problem where you kind of have to guess what to do best. So there's this approach provides a very efficient and systematic way to construct functionals using all available data. So we can, in the cost function, we can include simulated data, we can include experimental data. We don't really care what properties, as long as DFT can calculate them, we can compare with them, and we can make sure that we do as good as possible. We think this is a very promising avenue to achieve chemical accuracy for generic systems at a very low computational cost, because if I know what property you care about and what set of systems you're doing, then this is a systematic way to feed it the data you need and build a specific exchange correlation functional that's going to be best in class. So it's going to sit on the Pareto front of your parameter space for any application that you care about, and you get to pick it. So again, there's very little choice, if you like, that goes into this. It's a systematic tool and an algorithm that will systematically improve your models. And that's interesting, because what that means is that if we now expand our use case and complexity of the neural network representations, I've not had time too much to talk about that, it allows you to actually move away from the simple function space and potentially move into the functional space, which is much larger, where you can start to look for what the behavior of the universal functional now looks like, because you have a systematic way of trying to sample it. So all of the work that's been done here is open source. So by all means, there's been a library developed by Mohammed that you can also download, which is called SciTorch for differentiable computing. And you can look at all the tools. The core people that I really should thank is Mohammed Qasim, who's done virtually all of the work that I've talked about, at least most of it. And of course, Francisco, Vignati, and Karim, who are driving the project at the moment. So I'll leave you with this slide, and thank you very much.